Have you ever worked really hard on a sewing project and then once you finished, you put it on, you looked at it and thought, this doesn't look quite as good as I thought it would? And you followed all the instructions, but it just doesn't look as professional as you thought it should. Or worse yet, it looks like a home ec project. Well, today I'm sharing the one step that can totally elevate anything you make. And better yet, I'm going to show you how to do it. So keep watching. Hi, I'm Tony, and this is So Lounge. Now, the one thing that will totally change your sewing game is pressing as you sew. Not only do you need to do it, but I'm going to show you why you need to do it step by step as I make a top. And to prove my point, I already made one top with no pressing, and this is what it looks like. It's not that bad, but it's not that good either. I mean, is this really something you'd want to wear? Maybe if you were desperate and all of your other clothes were dirty, but it's done, it's finished. I followed the instructions with the exception of pressing, and I mean, it's okay. I'm going to show you how to make this exact same shirt with pressing and all the steps involved so you know exactly when to press and why you should and what it's going to look like if you don't. Now, pressing as you sew means that when you sew a seam, you press it. Now, that doesn't mean you can only sew one seam at a time and then you have to go press it, but you want to sew the seams that are not being intersected by any other seams and then go press before you continue. So the first thing I need to press open is the center back seam. Now, if you don't know, pressing is the act of lifting up and putting back down your iron. Ironing is moving the iron back and forth, which is what you would do to your fabric before you cut everything out. But this is going to press open the seam allowance, get it ready for finishing, and then it's also going to prep it for the next step of doing whatever that is. For the shoulder seams, eventually we're going to be attaching sleeves and then putting in underarm seams. And so all of those seams need to be pressed as we go through that process. When you press, it's really important that you pay attention to the heat of your iron and the fiber content that you're using. Now, the good news is that these days irons are very, very specific in the types of fibers. They have delicates, which is usually synthetics, and then it has a setting for like wool and silk, and it has a linen cotton setting. I'm looking at my iron as I'm saying this. This is a Rowenta iron. It is super steamy. You can see how many holes are on it. So this is 100% cotton batik fabric that my sister bought me in Thailand, and I have it on the cotton setting. I do have the steam kind of towards the high side because cotton can take a lot of heat. I primarily sew with natural fibers because they do take more heat, and when you do this kind of pressing, it does look good and you get some nice crisp seams because you can get high heat on them. But if you prefer polyester or, blends, poly cotton blends or anything like that, that is totally fine. Just make sure that you test your fabric with the scrap and iron and, do all that good stuff. If you are using a 100% synthetic fabric, then you definitely want to use a press cloth when you are pressing. That way, if the heat's a little on the high side, you're not going to have your fabric melt all over your iron, and it will protect your fabric from scorching or this weird thing where it kind of like has like it kind of melts a little bit, so it gets a little shiny. That is means your iron's too hot, and you don't want to use that. Additionally, if you are using a serger to finish your seams, which is what I'm going to go do, and you finish all your edges before you start sewing, just make sure that you use a press cloth because most serger thread is polyester, and if your fabrics and your iron is set for cotton, then that could potentially melt. So you might want to just grab press cloth to be on the safe side. I've got both of my sleeves sewn in, and I want you to notice that this is a curved seam because it's the one that's going to go over your shoulder. So when we press it, we want to make sure that we keep that curve in it. Now the next step is going to be to put this underarm seam together, and we want our seam going towards the outside of the sleeve so that when we go back in and put that next seam in, everything is going to lay nice and flat. So I'm going to be using a ham. This is a pressing ham. It is from, they have them everywhere. It's a Dritz pressing ham, I believe. And I'm just going to put my curved seam over this ham. That's going to keep the nice curve in that seam. And I'm just going to press. Knowing how to press things is as important as knowing when to press things. So keeping the curves in the curved seams is important, and using a ham is a great way to achieve that. Now, if you don't have a pressing ham, and you don't want to spend the money to get one, you can take a hand towel and kind of roll it into a log and then fold it in half and create the same shape so that you can use it for your curved seams. I have this shirt turned inside out to illustrate what it looks like when you don't do any pressing of the seams. So I did not press the shoulder seams open. When I added the sleeve, it looks okay. It did catch it going the right way, but the seam itself is kind of twisted and open. When I attached the facing, then that's where the problem started, because part of the seam caught when I attached the facing, and then the second part of the seam caught when I added the understitching. And you've got this twisty, turny sleeve. Now on this sleeve, the seam allowance is going towards the front. On the other one, it's twisted towards the back. And from the outside, that does not look great. It's very lumpy, bumpy. And that's not something that ironing after the fact can fix, because it's in there and it's going to stay in there. Now, when we look at the seam finish on the hem for the sleeve, it's also not great. The seam is standing open. It did catch kind of okay. Same with this bottom piece here. It still would be better if it was flat, and then the hem would go in nicer and much more evenly. Before I pin in this underarm seam, I'm going to press the hem of the sleeve into place. I'm not going to do any stitching yet, but I want to prep this step at this point in time so that once I do get the sleeve underarm seam all put together, this will be ready to go. Now, this is another one of those things I did not do the first time around, and it's very hard to get this folded evenly once the sleeve is already round, and pressing makes a huge difference to speed up that process and make it easier. And that's one thing that I realized that I don't think I knew when I learned to sew, is that pressing helps the whole process go a lot smoother, because all of your seams are lying flat. You're not going to accidentally sew something together that shouldn't be sewn, and then have to go back and rip it all out, which is very aggravating in the long run. One other thing I forgot to mention about pressing is that when you press and your fabric's hot, don't move it until it cools, because that's helping the fabric set in place. And that's also the point of pressing, is to get your fabric to be where it needs to be and take the shape that you want it to take. And if you start moving it before it's cooled off, then it's not going to set the same way that it could. I have my side seams all sewn, and now I'm going to get in there and press them. If you have a fabric that is very, very fine or thin, like a lawn or any kind of a very lightweight silk, you might not want to press the seam allowances open hard, because it might show up on the other side of the fabric if you have a very lightweight fabric. So one thing you can do is use one of these sleeve shaped pressing hams. And I think it's like a pressing roll is what they call it. It's not technically a ham. And then use that, because your fabric will then lie on the sides. And when you press it, it's not going to get pressed against it because your fabric's curved. Or in the alternative, you can always use a piece of newsprint or a paper bag and just slide it under the edges. So then when you press, it's not going to leave this edge mark of the seam on the right side of the fabric. By pre-pressing the sleeve and getting that fold in place before we put the whole sleeve together, it made it super, super easy to fold it back along that crease line and then sew in the final stitch line to finish out the sleeve. Now I'm just going to use my arm press to press this curve, and I'm not pressing on the stitch lines, I'm kind of pressing along the edge of the sleeve where the fold is. Now, keep in mind, and this goes for hems as well, that if you have a soft hem or you want a soft finish on the end of your sleeve, you do not want to press a hard crease into it. So just use some steam. You can hold your iron over it, just lightly steam it to kind of get any creases out, and then let it cool, and then go on and do the whole thing all the way around, and that's going to give you a softer finish on the end. Once you decide how much you want your hem to be folded up, you can go along and do that. It is a lot easier to do this and press it in before you go sit at your sewing machine, because once you get over there, it's easy to get off track. And if you have it all pressed in and you let your fabric cool, your fabric is going to naturally want to go along that fold line, which is going to make the whole process a whole lot easier. Now, next thing I need to do, and this is super, super important, is press the seam allowances of the facing towards the outside edge of the facing, because we're going to go back in and do some understitching to keep that seam and the seam allowance all pulled towards the facing, which means it won't pop up later. And to do this right, it really helps if you press the seam first. Now, I did this with the sample with no pressing, and it was very, very difficult, and it made for a very messy finish. Now, I am using my ham again, or you could use a rolled up towel, and I am just going to go along this whole edge, press it out towards the edge of the facing, and do that with the whole neckline. And then I'm going to go in and do some understitching. And the end result is going to look great. It is going to look super professional. I'm going to do a quick press along that neckline just to get that top edge nice and crisp. And then we'll look at the finished product. This is the unpressed version. And you can see, while it's wearable, it looks kind of frumpy. It doesn't look quite finished, and you're not going to fool anybody into thinking this was bought at a store anywhere. It really does look kind of like a home ec project that you probably got a C+ on. Compared to this, I think we can all agree this looks so much better than the other one. And while you may not be able to put your finger on what the difference is, we both know it's all pressing. Look at the crisp seam finish on my sleeve. My neckline looks great. The hem looks fabulous. Overall, this entire top just looks far superior to the other one. It looks finished. It looks professional. And best of all, you're totally going to fool everyone you know into thinking you bought it somewhere, which is quite possibly the best part of it all. So now that you know how much pressing can help improve the look of the outside of your garment, you totally want to check out this video. Coming up next, I'm going to show you seam finishes so that the inside looks just as beautiful as the outside, and I'll see you over there.